Okay, Doug. All right, Q. Do you want to give a brief intro? I think most people know your background, but it's still badass, so I like hearing it each time. And then kind of where you are now with your rotation, and then if you have plans after graduation, since you're about to graduate, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So my name is Q, Willie. I am from Salt Lake City, Utah, originally, and have kind of been all over the country since then. Played football and lacrosse. So I was much better at lacrosse, but still not great. Um, just hustled hard and managed to be on some good teams and had some good experiences along the way. Um, Kind of culminating at the University of North Carolina with the national championship and the ACC championship the next year after that. So it was awesome to be a part of that. I had a strength and conditioning coach there who was on the USA bobsled team several years ago and just said, "Hey, man, I think you'd really like it. Give it a shot." Randomly went out to a combine and it worked out well. Did well enough to get some looks, and then luckily, in my last clinical rotation, I've been at a VA in California, in Monterey, so primarily working with veterans there. And there was a bobsled coach out there, luckily enough. So I've been training with him, trying to roll into the USA bobsled scene when school is over, trying to manage how to get clinic life settled while still competing internationally with USA bobsled. So that is yet to be completely hashed out, as you can imagine. But no, so here I'm now in Nevada with John Hodges, and it's been a great experience. Really cool, diverse patient population. You know, you work with an NFL tight end in the morning, and then you've got 69-year-old Susan in the afternoon, which is just awesome. You get a huge range of everybody. So yeah, and then after this all starts, or sorry, after all this is over with the clinics, trying to still figure out what we're going to be doing afterwards. There's a couple of things in the air, so I don't want to get too certain on one thing just yet. So we'll see. We'll see.
Dope. That was perfect. And Q has a wife and two kids, so he's
Yeah,
not a little on his
that's
plate.
great.
So yeah, I asked you kind of what type of papers you were interested in, and you were like, well, we could do PT related or sprinting. And I'm like, well, your background just makes more sense sprinting. And then you sent over like four papers, and you chose this one in particular. Do you have a reason why you wanted to chat about this one?
Yeah. So there are a couple of good overall review papers on just backwards walking, backwards running for neurological populations, ACL populations, patellofemoral joint population, pain type stuff. Performance type populations. This one was interesting. One, because I thought it was really well done, methods wise. I thought they did a pretty clean job in a training study. Those are usually a little bit tougher to do. And then two, it was one of the first studies that's really kind of gone into, okay, how does backwards running really relate or change forward running? Because ultimately, I think most people are concerned with how fast you can run forward, especially if you're working with NFL combine type stuff. For me, bobsled, it's all track testing. You test everything on a track before you even go on the ice. So I think with 40 times, and most people just in general in the sports performance world are most concerned with the forward component of sprinting. So I thought it was interesting that there might be some carryover or transference from backwards running to forward running, but hopefully, I'm going to make backwards running sound super, super cool today. Like it's a weird niche thing. I recognize that it's maybe not utilized as much as forward running, but I don't want you to walk away from this. We're going to talk about a couple of different papers and some really great stuff, but again, this all boils down to how you season the steak. I mean, it's I think there's a lot of different ways to get faster. There's a lot of different ways you can train. We know that. We know that there's a lot of different non-specific ways to train to get better at sprinting. This is just one that I think has clinical utility that's easily accessible without equipment, has some nice, I guess, other applications in the pain rehab type realm. But I don't want you to. I'm going to make it sound awesome, and I have my own biases. I'm aware of those, but don't walk away from this thinking this is like the newest, greatest thing that you must do. And if you're not doing this, you're missing out. It's just one piece of the pie that I think could be helpful, and I hope to kind of help you guys see maybe some of the uses of it.
Oh yeah.
So,
All right. Do you want to give a kind of an outline of how the study was performed, and then we can just go into like kind of a back and forth of our thoughts on it?
yeah, for sure. So, like I said, they just wanted to figure out if we test adolescent males, their sprinting times going forward, then put them on either a forward running sprint program or a backward running sprint program. How does that hash out after about 8 weeks of training in either forward running or backward running to their repeated their sprint time at the end? Just what made them faster. So they basically took these kids that were signed up for their school's little athletic development thing and split them in half. Half the group got to a backwards running program, the other half a forward running program. They had a control group that were just the general PE kids, which I thought was nice because we're dealing with youth. It's hard to tell if, over the course of, maybe just their maturation, growth, are they just getting faster because they're generally physically active and they're young and they're responding to everything versus is there some kind of effect from a specific training stimulus? I think, from most of what we read about the long-term athletic development model, it's as long as kids are just playing and being active, that's probably going to be a whole lot better than nothing, and maybe even better than specific things. But they were just trying to figure out, does this backwards running piece mean anything when talking about forward sprinting speed? Um, so, anyways, they did a if you did want to apply backward, running training into a program, they do give out a pretty nice little like program that you could print out or take pictures of that is really not too crazy of the volume. It's pretty easy to have somebody do that. So I like their program if you were going to do this, but that's kind of how they set it up, where they had a couple of days where they were doing some introduction to the testing procedures, um, introduction to the jump mat. They were measuring counter movement jump as well. Um, so a couple of different things, but I liked that they had a couple of days of that integration, kind of feel it out. The kids probably had never done any testing like this before. Anyways, what else you want to know, Chris? What do we got here?
It was good. Maybe talk about the results, just outcome, like control FRT versus BRT, and then maybe why we think that was the case.
Yeah. So overall, it trended that it was appeared that the backwards running had a greater effect on sprint speed over the 10 and 20 meters. So it wasn't real long sprints. This is all short distance sprinting, which, if you think about like sports, field sports, court sports, that's usually what maybe you're going to be more concerned about is the acceleration phases and those, lower end things. If you were talking track and field, this might not be quite as applicable as maybe you're more interested in the top end speed, or you're looking at 200 meters, 400 meters, 800-meter type runs. This would be more applicable to just general field and court sports. So results wise, backwards running training over the course of that 8 weeks had a little bit better sprint performance, a little bit better counter movement jump performance. Let me look here. Yeah, I know there was a little bit difference in one here. There was some differences with like, was it over the course of the full 20 meters? Was it the timing gate between 10 and 20 meters? And was it, timing gate between 0 and 10? This study, as well as others, has shown maybe better results with backwards running training in that 0 to 10 meter running, that initial acceleration phase, than it did over the 10 to 20. I believe in this particular study, they did still do better in the 10 to 20. Correct me if I'm wrong.
They said
I
10
think that
and 20, not 10 to 20, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So this is just like I guess a microcosm kind of a paper of maybe some larger things that we'll talk about today. Um, But overall, you take these kids who were, what was it, 14 to 15 years old, put them through a backwards running training, test their counter movement jump, vertical jumps, and then their sprint performance. Group that did backwards running training on average got a little bit better. Not a huge sample size, not something that, all of a sudden you're going to do backwards running training with everybody, but it's something significant that you can run backwards and get faster going forwards. That's odd, right? It's not specific, but for whatever reason, and we'll kind of talk about maybe some potential mechanisms that have kind of been talked about in other reviews at large, but I think there's something here. Both it's been done in adults. This is kind of one of the first done in youth athletes. I think it's silly that sometimes they were citing studies that was like forward running training is good for forward running. Like, well, yeah, like if you sprint forward for a training session, you're over the course of 8 weeks, you're probably going to get faster at running forward. So the real like novelty of this was like, can I run as fast as I can backwards and then get faster going forwards? And I think this study is, at least some evidence that maybe you can. Take that with a grain of salt. This is just 14 to 15-year-old boys in one part of the world in a fairly small sample size, but I think there's something here, and I think it does have some clinical utility.
Q, I kind of had a question. I like the way you like set this up, that you're like, hey, this isn't the end all be all, but it's definitely another like tool in the toolbox sort of thing that does carry over to forward running. I guess I kind of had a question about like, are you familiar with anything that's done with like strictly like change of direction training versus something like this? I really liked like the control in this and everything like that. I was just wondering if like there's been anything about like change of direction training with forward running.
With forward running or with backward running as well?
I mean, this is I guess more like the effect on like forward running off of just like a change of direction sort of training or protocol like that.
There's probably about, at least in the review, two reviews that I read on backward run training, it appeared there was maybe between 6 to 8 studies on like better ones that were on forward training that related to change of direction. There was only two that I'm aware of for backwards running training where they also did like t-tests and the like 5-10-5 cone drills. One was by Swati. It's like, I think it was from India, and then the other one was somewhere in the UK. It was I have it written down here. Threlkeld et al. They did some change of direction training. All that I can say about the forward running is that yes, a forward running program, I think just by nature that they're doing something fast, it almost always showed that their cutting got better. Now I don't know what that would compare to a specific cutting program compared to forward running, and the only one of those two studies that I mentioned with backwards running compared it to forward running. There was not a significant difference in the cutting between the forward running group and the backward running group. The other study from the India one, Swati et al., only did backwards walking and backwards running. So of course the backwards running group got better at cutting. It's kind of okay that it wasn't super helpful. But at least what we found, or what the that UK study found from the backwards running and forward running in cutting type procedures, there was no significant difference. So you could do either and probably see good benefit. Does that help?
Yeah, that does help. Yeah, I mean, I'm just like, all of these, we're talking like explosive movements, in like the concentric, like explosive nature of things. I was just, it does make sense that a lot of this stuff is just going to carry over. So I guess another thing, is there anything after reading this study, like you feel like they maybe missed, or like you'd want to see like more continuation on with?
With this particular study,
Yeah.
it would be a little bit more interesting to me to do longer backwards running drills. I think the longest they got up to is 20 yards or meters. Assuming it's meters because this is done in Australia. Yeah, 20 meters. So, I would be interested to see what would happen if they had backwards sprint drills that progressed up to 30, 40, 50, and if that helped with maybe higher end speed. I think they also, they did measure counter movement jump, but like you were kind of mentioning, adding some kind of cutting component would be very interesting. This particular study didn't do this, but there's plenty of other studies that have measured with biodex, like peak torque, plantar flexion, peak torque, knee extension strength, hip strength, hip flexion, abduction, adduction. I think a lot of that kind of stuff could be interesting. I don't know if it's like, they really dropped the ball because they didn't do it in this study, but I think that some more of that information would be a little bit more convincing whether to include this or not include it in your training paradigms.
Have you seen anybody that's done this with a much larger sample size? I guess and you were very clear on this. This is like a lot more hypothesis inducing than anything else, right? Because I didn't really see how I guess there was a little bit of a power analysis that they ran a little bit, but I mean I'm not completely familiar with the subject, so I don't know if the minimum that they chose for minimal detective change that they chose is accurate, but it seems like the study is underpowered, and it's weird to me that their forward running group, even though they said they randomized, was n equals 14 compared to n equals 25. Like you said, you randomized. Why is there such a large difference in your two groups? And then when you underpower studies, and then you get what they measured four variables, you start getting a lot of false positives or a lot of type 1 errors. So like I definitely want to emphasize that like this is for sure more hypothesis inducing than like I'm going to take this for anything. At least like backwards running is probably not bad.
Yeah, right. Probably not bad. No, but Geronimo, you make some good points. I think you're right. If they didn't do the power calculation maybe up to snuff, it's a small sample size. I think that's why this paper was like I said, kind of a microcosm of what maybe is existing at large. If you dive into some of the review papers, and I've got, let's see, over 15 studies written down here on this other piece of paper that have all investigated backwards running. So if you kind of were to maybe accumulate all of those sample sizes, you might have something there. Not saying that all of a sudden makes it like over the moon important, but I think that this is, like you said, it's a hypothesis. It's enough to kind of question and maybe wonder if we're doing enough of this. If it would be helpful, and I think it might be helpful to kind of get into maybe some of the maybe more at-large literature, kind of shifting focus away from this one particular paper. This was more just to introduce you to the idea that backwards running might be effective in producing better sprint velocities going forward, maybe better counter movement jumps, just to start making you question like, there's a whole world of backwards running that might, be, sports specific or sports important, I guess is what I should say. So if that's cool, can we transition away, or do we have any more questions on this particular paper? I'm happy to talk about it more, but I guess the focus for today was to kind of like talk about backwards running at large on a large scale. This paper was just kind of one little drop in the pond.
Yeah, do they differentiate between backpedaling and backwards running in the literature?
Yeah, absolutely. So they do the difference between like absolute versus relative speeds with backwards running and forwards running. So on average, backwards running is 30% slower at your highest intensity for backwards running than it will be forwards, which kind of makes sense. Like you just can't run backwards as fast. There is a distinction between backpedaling and backwards running. So if you look at this group, the Utah group, they have a couple of different coaching cues that they included in this, with the forward trunk lean, the long reaches in the strides, like powerful push off, versus like the upward trunk, kind of leaning back, just like cycling your feet underneath you. In the literature at large, when they talk about the absolute running speeds, they'll set like, say we have like 2.5 meters per second. You know, so like jogging forward versus like jogging backwards, that's going to look a little bit more like a back pedal than like an upwards running backwards sprint. In this particular study, it was an upwards running backwards sprint. So everything that they did in training was like more of a, you know, especially when they got to the high velocity. If you look at that program they had, that was like a almost close to max effort sprints forward. It was also a close to max effort sprint backwards. So yeah, there's a difference between backpedaling and backwards running that is fleshed out in this paper, but it's also fleshed out. You see that in the studies at large as well.
Ben asked on the chat, this may be too broad of a question, but what biomechanical demands of backwards running do you think transfers to forwards?
Sweet. All right. We get into, we're going to transition then. So that's a good question, Ben. So a couple of things. There's four pretty good papers about this. There's Flynn, Cavagna, Sturzig, I guess 5, Wright, and then Wayand. And each of these papers was kind of looking at the kinematics from like what's the difference between backwards and forward running at different speeds, absolute speeds across the board, as well as relative intensities. I think the relative intensity was reported as a percentage of what they could run maximally, and that every speed subsequent to that maximal was then the same way you do in like weight training. You know, it was like 80% of your max speed. So they did it for backwards and forwards. So a couple of the like biomechanical type things that we might be concerned about. These are some interesting things that will kind of transition into the clinical stuff too. But you have a mostly isometric and concentric demand at the quads and at the ankle for plantar flexion when you're running backwards. So when you're running forwards, there's going to be a little bit more of that eccentric braking force demand rolling over the foot and then propelling the body forward. So if you think about like speed in general, you're always going to have braking forces and you're always going to have propulsive forces. You maintain speed as long as those two things remain equal. If your braking forces are not more than your propulsive forces, you stay constant speed. If your propulsive forces are more than braking forces, you're going to be accelerating, essentially, right? That's kind of the idea. So in backwards running, there's significantly less braking forces at initial contact. And then as you go to push off, you have like in the quad and plantar flexors, I guess especially you have more of those propulsive forces happening. So you get like, okay, so just some general percentages here from averaged across all 5 of these studies. There's a 22% greater rate of force development in the muscles of the quadriceps in backwards running than in forwards running. Part of that reason why is because in forward running, like we talked about, there being a greater concentric and isometric demand going backwards. Well, there's an eccentric demand when you're running forwards. So a lot of that comes from that stretch shortening cycle of the tendinous unit when you're running forward. So you get that energy return out of the tendon. When you run backwards, you don't get as much of that. So it's your propulsion is higher demand on the muscle unit of producing force versus the tendinous unit to store and release energy. So that's why you're seeing, or that's why I said there's a 22% greater rate of force development, but that's in the muscle. That's not necessarily ground contact time at large. That's in the actual belly of the muscle, the quads in particular. You can look at, there's also a higher stiffness in the leg at the patellar tendon when we talk about running backwards, just because there simply isn't as much of an eccentric absorption phase when you're running backwards as there is running forwards. So overall, I can tell you, so from the Wright and weigh-in paper, there's a 14% increase in the average muscle force per unit of ground force during backwards running. So for every unit of ground force being applied, there's a 14% greater amount of force in the quadriceps to produce that ground force per unit versus running forward. So again, we're talking about maybe muscle force over that tendinous storage of that elastic energy. And then there's a 10% more muscle volume activated per unit of ground force. So we have more motor units, which makes sense because you're getting more quad activation. So I don't need to explain that to you guys, but I guess overall from a biomechanical demand, you're getting a greater muscle stimulus in the quadriceps and the plantar flexors in particular going in reverse than you do going forward. There's also a greater stiffness. So you're training the qualities of stiffness and maybe less of the quality of compliance in backwards running, preferentially, right? So when you run forwards, the idea here, and again, this is I'm not telling you this is exactly how it works. I'm telling you I'm making some jumps between what they found kinematically in other studies, what happens in backwards running, and then trying to draw a conclusion of what might be potentially going on in forwards running. And I think it just simply could be that you're preferentially training some of the stiffness and more of the muscular components. Now, these are youth, right? So we have to assume that these kids aren't necessarily well-trained, athletic specimens that have a whole lot of strength. So maybe just getting them a little bit stronger, just like you see in other non-specific training things like squatting and deadlifting, might have potentially helped them to improve their sprint acceleration performance. I'm not sure, but I think that could be a component based on everything else that I'm reading and seeing from other backwards running literature. Does that kind of help a little bit answer that question, Ben?
You kind of like going off of talking about the changes in the tendon and the muscle demand. With those studies, did it talk about like below the knee, lower leg, anything with that? Just because I'm thinking, I mean, forward running versus Achilles tendon versus your backpedaling.
Yeah, so no, that's a good question. So in the Threcold study, they measured both knee extension torque, and then they also measured plantar flexion torque with the little Biodex, like little foot pedal guy. And this one, I have mixed feelings about because the knee extension torque was twice as great for the backwards running group. They took, okay, so let me give you the preface. They took, it was somewhere between, let me look, like 25 to 30 more distance runners though. This is more with distance running kind of folks. And they just basically had the control group continue their forward running program as normal. And then they took the other group and had them running, start integrating backwards running. And it was more like the same tempo. So it was like a 12-minute mile or something like that tempo pace, but running backwards. So not sprinting, but just integrating a lot of backwards running work. So that would maybe be closer to somewhere between the backpedaling and that like big backward stride kind of thing we're looking for. Yes, Chris, awful. I don't know if you guys have ever tried running backwards for like a mile or something. It's horrible. But so basically they measured after doing that, it was an 8-week training study where they just started integrating more and more backwards running in the group. Then they brought them back in and Biodex test them. The group that ran backwards had a 2 times greater torque at the knee extension, but then they had a 10 times greater plantar flexion torque. And that's where I'm kind of like, I don't know. That seems a lot, an awful lot. I definitely think so. Based on the other, kinematic type studies that I was looking at, they were talking about how the foot acts very similarly in backwards running, where it's predominantly concentric and isometric force. Because when you land, going backwards, you're pushing kind of off the ball of your foot. You're not really rolling over your heel. Whereas when you go forward, you kind of roll through the heel a little bit, or maybe even flat foot. So there's a little bit of that like pronation into that push off kind of phase. So there is a little bit of more force absorption. Whereas you're going back, that ball of the foot or toe kind of hits, and then you're just striking and pushing off. So there's really not a whole lot of force absorption. It's purely more based on force production. And then you have in backwards running, you have a lot more plantar flexion, end range plantar flexion when you go to push off, because the tibia is now rolling backwards as the toe is still pushing the other way. You actually get more plantar flexion going in reverse at absolute speeds than you do going forward.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, I'm curious to read that one.
Q, do you think, I'm assuming for this shorter distance of like 10, 15, 20 meters, since they're both, I mean, you assume like acceleration versus like top end mechanics, there's longer time spent ground contact, there's more forward lean, probably for both of these groups. Do you think that's why there's probably more carryover than like if you were to test like 100, 200, 300 meters, where, I mean, the kinematics change obviously, but like the kinetics as well of, there's so much quad, as you said, for this group, and that would make sense for like an accelerative, like kinematic position. Do you think it's specific, or there's carryover because it is still like they probably have longer ground contact, they're just producing a lot more force, just as what you would need for a forward position?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Chris. So if it's all based on how relatively fast you're actually running in reverse compared to how relatively fast you're running forward. So beginning, and I don't have all the exact percentages. This is what's I've been reading in the studies, and it's also just something that practically makes sense. I don't think there's been enough study on like nailing down the actual like relative speed at which this kind of switch happens, but at lower speeds running backwards, you get increased stride frequency, right? You just have to step faster. If you like jogged backwards, like you're going to be cycling a lot quicker than jogging forwards. That's why jogging backwards is terrible. You're expending tons of energy. There's been plenty of studies that have explored the metabolic demand of running backwards versus metabolic demand of running forward at an absolute given pace. Heart rate, O2 consumption, blood lactate, all significantly worse, or I guess better, depending on what you want. But I think it's worse because it burns like crazy going backwards at a relative jogging or an absolute jogging pace compared to forwards. So forwards, you're going to have more ground contact time. So this is maybe an important distinction in to help the question you just asked. So there's an inverse relationship, a very simple inverse relationship between the amount of energy that's expended to run and the amount of time that the foot spends on the ground. Does that make sense? So if I have more energy coming into that ground, I'm going to spend less time on the ground, right? So up to a given point, running backwards, you're increasing your stride frequency and having shorter ground contact times. Then at some point, as you switch to more of that top end speed running in reverse, you actually have longer ground contact times compared to forward running. So where the adaptation specifically happens, I can't tell you. I don't know exactly why it would produce a better forward running speed. I think part of it is simply that there's some novelty to the stimulus. There's some training variety. I think that has to be said. Both neurologically, there was 2 or 3 studies that honestly I didn't get that deep into. One that was a little bit longer and more of a review from Hugkamer. I didn't understand half the stuff they were talking about with like neural circuitry. It's like, this is beyond my ability, but they were trying to talk about and do more of a review on that motor learning component, and are the neural circuitries running forward or moving, propelling yourself forward similar to those backwards. There's some debate there, but overall they were just saying that you take away a visual stimulus, it's running in reverse that could have a different like contextual effect, a different variety of training compared to what they normally do. Maybe important to note too that these kids were still playing other sports outside of school. I don't know what kind of demands those sports were doing. That's something they could have controlled for potentially. So why the backwards running group specifically got faster from a very deep, like I can be sure and hang my hat on this, I don't know. I have some thoughts. I have my biases based on other studies I'm seeing and maybe some potential training effects. But again, I don't think that there's anything incredibly magical that happens when all of a sudden you run in reverse. Like I don't think it's the panacea of like running forward is like it hinges on your ability to run backwards. But I do think there's some value here. Because of the way that the contraction happens. This is maybe more of clinical use here is the patellofemoral joint stress is significantly less. So over the course of, let me look here, I have this written down, 3 studies from Flynn, Roos, and Sussman. And I can include all these papers if you want. I don't know if anyone wants to dive into the wide world of backwards running, but it's not super exciting and it's very niche, but there are folks out there doing this who are into it. But these 3 papers together, it was an average of 72% less patellofemoral joint stress while running in reverse at any given speed compared to running forward. So just some like clinical utility. I've got 7 patients right now with knee pain, some coming off meniscus, all the way from athletes to TKAs that I either have backwards walking or backwards running to get more of a conditioning stimulus in, because forward walking or forward running is aggravating. But I can take them out on the turf and I can run them like 100 meter repeats going backwards and they won't have knee pain. So, I don't think that, again, this might not work for everyone. It's something I'm seeing working. It could just be my own way of communicating why I'm having them run backwards. The contextual effect of what I'm telling him, how it will feel if they run backwards. I don't know, but I know that if I tell them to run forwards, they have knee pain. And then I'm like, well, how about you just, try to run backwards. Let's see what happens there. And they can run backwards and they're like, oh, that's weird. Like, it doesn't hurt, but I'm tired as hell. You know what I mean? So it's like for a distance runner or for someone who's just recreationally active, I think it can be useful if they have some knee pain, because they can get a crazy, you get these grinders, right? Especially with runners, it's either all or nothing. If they're not running the 5 miles they're used to in their program, then it's like, well, my shit sucks and PT sucks. And I hate this rehab process, but it's like, if I can have you run backwards, yeah, it's kind of weird, but they can run backwards and get a crazy grindy metabolic type workout, feel like they're really exercising, and they don't have knee pain, and I think it's just a good introduction into running, because then they get some confidence that like, hey, I'm actually running, I'm pushing off one leg at a time. It's similar to running, but man, my knee actually doesn't bother me. So I think there's some utility there. But let me read in the comments here. So
Hugh, just a second. We have higher quad activation. We have stiffness in the tendon, yet we have less patellofemoral reaction forces.
Yeah, isn't that weird?
That's trippy.
And I think so. Part of why they postulate that is because of the foot. So they're talking about like where the angle of contact from the foot to the knee is and why that might. So when you're running forward, either you have heel strike or you have that flat foot strike, which is going to basically, if you have the knee here and then you're taking the angle behind the foot and wrapping it around the knee that way, you're going to
have the tibial angle is driving that, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Right. Wow.
When you go back, the initial contact is actually not where you're having the most spike in patellofemoral stress when you're running backwards, because that's where your momentum is taking you. It's actually, you're getting the peak force output almost at that mid stance phase where the tibia is a little bit more vertical and you're focused on the propulsion of the foot forward to get you to go backwards. So yeah, in that it's crazy that you can get such a significant quad adaptation and quad activation without creating a lot of patellofemoral stress. It's the craziest thing. I had a kid this past week. He has been strength training and doing all kinds of positional tolerance, really, really deep knee bend type training on slant boards, everything, because he's been dealing with patellofemoral pain, and that stuff doesn't bother him at all. We've done tons of hip strengthening, tons of box squats, deadlifting. I mean, this guy is doing it all. And then the other day, this was 2 weeks ago, he's like, yeah, I just had to run to my car because I forgot some keys in my car. And man, I had knee pain the whole rest of the day. I jogged like half a mile and I could not even, it was so painful the rest of the day. And then it was like, well, you want to try backwards running? He's like, I don't know. We'll give it a shot. Dude, I cooked this kid on the, we have, because I'm at the University of Nevada, so we have access to the football field out there. And it was just like down, back, down, back, down, back, down, all in reverse, no pain. Talked to him a week later. He's like, dude, I don't know what happened, but it doesn't hurt. And he was cooked. You know what I mean? So I don't know. These are just things I'm seeing. I I can't tell you that it's everything. I'm not going to sell you anything or tell you that if you're not doing backwards running, then you're missing the mark. That's not what I'm trying to say at all. It's just like, damn, this is kind of cool and it's working. There's this whole world of research out there on backwards running from a neurological perspective, from a pain perspective, from a performance perspective. If you look at all of the FIFA 11 stuff and all the hype that Nordic hamstrings got, well, backwards running is in there too, but we're not giving backwards running the same attention. You know, backwards running is in all these injury prevention type protocols. And even in ACL research, reverse running is introduced before forward running on multiple studies that I've read. And I don't know, you know how there's like the peak strain on the ACL studies with overground walking or treadmill walking. I haven't seen any for walking in reverse. I'm not aware of. Maybe you guys are. But I don't know about that because I know John Hodges has some holdbacks on lunging with the involved leg back. He'll lunge him with the involved leg forward, but not the involved leg back earlier in the ACL rehab, just because there's a higher ACL strain going backwards because of that tibia angle and where the quad's pulling. I'd almost assume that's somewhat similar to going backwards. So I don't know. I haven't seen it, but I do think there's something here, especially for patellofemoral joint or, meniscectomy type patients that are just dealing with general knee pain. Like I said, even TKA, I have 2 TKA patients that I put on a treadmill and don't turn on the treadmill and just have them push it backwards in reverse for like as long as they possibly can until they burn out. And they love it. Crazy metabolic demand. It helps them walk a little bit more upright when they're done because their quads are so freaking cooked that they can do nothing else but stand upright. So anyways, I think there's some benefit here, but these are some interesting thoughts. Anybody else have any questions? I'll try to answer in maybe a shorter time frame. I know I'm rambling here.
I was going to say, prior to the patellofemoral component, I really just saw this as we're forcing people, because especially with the cueing that they gave, the sprinters, forward sprinters were able to self-organize. The reverse ones are put into a training stimulus of, we want this mechanics, we want all this stuff. And basically all we're doing is training for that initial acceleration phase in a way that we know that we're getting more quad. But when we start dropping patellofemoral reaction forces and stuff, now the clinical utility to me starts to move a little bit, and I'll have to look into this a little bit more.
Yeah, it's very interesting. That's all I can say about it. I didn't realize, okay, so here's I do a lot of backwards running training in my own training because it feels better. If I've been dealing with like plantar fasciitis or my knees are just kind of achy that day, I can run backwards all day and it doesn't really bother me. It doesn't feel like the same, and maybe it's all contextual, because I know like, oh God, I got to sprint forward again. This is hard and it hurts, and then I run backwards and I'm all of a sudden like, oh, this isn't bad. I'm not even like training right now. This is fine, but I'm exhausted at the end of it. So I use it a lot, and I find that the way I think about it, and this is not true based on all of the biomechanical studies, but I think of it as like the eccentric of running forward. It's a way to introduce training variability that's not the thing, but similar to the thing that I find that I can tolerate, I can find my patients can tolerate, whether it's, even if it's just walking backwards. Use this with Parkinson's patients. I know there's some retro walking type studies in Parkinson's patients just because of that neurological stimulus, that ability to self-organize, but in a different way. You're getting some training, and just a different novel stimulus that forces them to do something different. I think there's something there for athletes. I mean, that's what we're always trying to do, right? Especially in rehab and preparing for sport, you're trying to add variability to a training program. And, you see, if any of you did the Kalu, seminar thing that they did, and the Healthy Baller, Wesley Wang, came on and did all the stuff, with like calling out numbers and math problems and distraction and just adding mental variability into training programs. I think backwards running can do some of that same thing. You no longer have a visual clue of where you are. You don't know where you are on the field. You have to rely on kind of where the body is feeling it. And it's a little bit different. So here's something else that's interesting. There was another study from Moore et al. They did in the UK. They took all the top 10 FIFA soccer teams, and usually all those soccer teams are already utilizing the GPS technology kind of on field for training load management type stuff. You know what I'm talking about? So they tried to gauge like how much of their time is spent running backwards and how much of their time is spent running forwards. And they did a bunch of other stuff like sideways and other things. But in a given match at that level, the elite level of soccer, only 0.9 to 1.4% of the time was spent sprinting forward. 3 to 4% of their time was spent sprinting backward. And then they noticed that those top tier teams in the top 10 compared to those who were not, on average, the players in those top tier teams ran more backwards than forwards in a given match. Don't know what that means, but it's like, hey, you've got these elite guys who are spending more time in a game running backwards. I don't know if that's a good thing. Maybe they're terrible. I don't know. If you're always running backwards, that doesn't really sound like you're scoring goals, but they're the best. I don't know. But they're spending more time running in reverse than they are running purely in a max effort forward. And those are the best soccer teams in the country. So why not train it? If we're leaving backwards running and backwards sprinting completely out of a program, or at least biasing it in some way, I feel like there's something left on the table there potentially. I don't know. It just kind of makes sense if you look at what happens from that standpoint. But again, I doubt that the top 10 teams all have a very strict backwards running protocol. I think they just go out and play their sport, and that's just what happens in their game. They're already getting that training stimulus. So I don't know, but it is interesting.
Hugh, when you have what seems like literally all of your patients on backwards running at this point,
True.
do you? Well, okay. So one, the lady that you have on the treadmill that the treadmill's not on, is she like holding the sides and just pushing back? And then with the people that are like on field, or I guess in general, are you cueing them at all, or are you just like, would you demo it, and like how much is going into this process?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So first question with the treadmill, yeah, I'll just put like an RX pad behind their back on the, how most treadmills have like a little rail or like screen of some kind. There's like a plastic stop. They just put their hips or back up against that. So I'll put like a little RX pad right there. And then I don't even, for some, I have to turn the treadmill on because they're not strong enough to get the treadmill moving. So I'll just put it on like 0.2 or 0.3. And their goal is just to keep up with it and take as big as steps as they can, like reaching the foot back and stepping through. And over the course of like, let's say you go like a minute or two on it, they'll start to like sink down a little bit at a time. So, and I like that. I want that to happen. I want them to like kind of fall into it because it requires more and more and more quad to catch themselves and then like step through and get that terminal extension over and over again. So it'll crush them towards the end. For those who are a little bit further along, or if they're just generally heavier patients, they can usually lean back and get the tread moving without turning it on. And then it's just a max effort. How long can you spin this thing? Or we'll go for like intervals or something like that on it, just, at the end of the workout for more like metabolic type conditioning stuff. And then your other question was how much cueing or training do I give people on the field or whatever when I take them out? So sometimes it depends. If it's a younger athlete, I just want to see how they do it first. I say, hey, we're going to just run backwards. I want you to push back and run as fast as you can to that 30-yard line, but all backwards. Just show me how you do it. And then once I see how they do it, then, you know, depending on how good or bad it was, I'll insert just a couple little things. So I'll just tell them something like this: hey, so you're really upright. How about you just try to hinge over a little bit more, kind of lean your chest forward, and then try to reach your feet back as you run backwards. Try that. That usually fixes a lot. You'll notice one of the patterns that you see a lot is people will like big circumduct as they reach back. They instead of pulling their heel to their butt and then cycling back, they'll tend to want to reach the heel out to the side. That's the other one that I see a lot. So then I'll just tell them, try to keep your knees kind of under your shoulders, and then just bring your feet as if you had back pockets. You're just bringing your heel to your back pocket and then reaching out behind you each step. That usually cleans up most of it. Outside of that, maybe the last and only cue I'd have to give is to just push harder, like cover more ground, just cover ground per step. That's about as far as I go, though. And that seems like I just over the course of like, you know, a couple rounds of 30 yards or a couple rounds of 50 yards, they'll figure it out, because it's hard to do it poorly. If you are running max effort backwards, you're going to fall on your ass before you figure it out. You know what I mean? So like if I'm telling them to run as hard as you possibly can backwards, usually they'll figure it out on their own, you know, after just a couple little simple like mechanical cues. But pretty easy to coach. And I think I thought at first most people would think it was really silly going back, but if you have a little bit of space, it's not too bad. And even if you don't have a whole lot of space, say if you have to be inside, it's snowing outside or whatever, you can use 20 yards inside pretty quick, because when you're running backwards, you can actually slow down an awful lot quicker than you can when you're running forward. So that deceleration is much easier because you already have the forward trunk lean. You already have your tibia angle when you're contacting going backwards is already going forwards. Does that make sense? So it's easier to slow down. I don't know how to explain that. That's really, I almost need like a visual here. I'm saying a lot of backwards and forwards and feel like I'm getting turning people around. But anyways, it's a lot easier to slow down. So you don't need a whole lot of space to actually get something out of this. You can get like 4 or 5, maybe up to 8 really good stride pushes going in reverse in a short space, and then they can slow down really quick. Versus going forward, if you take even like 3 or 4 really good acceleration strides, it's going to take you quite a bit longer to actually like break down and pat before you slam into a wall or a person or something.
For sport, like, I mean, what you're competing in with bobsled, because it's so specific it's not a field sport where you're literally never going to be backwards running, hopefully. What do you see any utility in it, or would it just be from like a rehab standpoint if they can't forwards run?
You kind of cut out for me. Can you say that last little bit one more time?
Yeah. So do you see any utility of it from like a training perspective for bobsled, or any sport that's purely forward, or no?
Yeah, for sure. So like I said, like I do a fair bit of this. One, because I can still do something fast. I can still work on stiffness. I can still work on a lot of the plyometric type properties of sprinting, but it's the different stimulus that gives me like a little bit of, you know, I don't know if you want to call it recovery, but I can at least take the gas pedal off running forward as much, and I can tolerate it better. I enjoy it. I think it feels really good to run backwards at full pace and then turn around and do a couple of reps running forward. It just feels a whole hell of a lot better. I definitely, so that being said, you know, I have one job in bobsled, right? To push straight ahead down a track and then jump in a sled. That's it. Like, and it's like 40 meters to 55 meters. That's it. But yeah, I still find utility in running backwards just as a training, you know, stimulus, a different variety, because I still do the other stuff. Like I don't know why, if I still squat or I still deadlift or I still power clean or I still do other strength training exercises, that's not running forward and getting into bobsled. But I do it. Others do it. We know from good evidence that strength stimulus in compound movements is, you know, effective at increasing sprint performance and maintaining, whether it's maybe it's just tissue tolerance, right? Maybe it's just you're maintaining the tissues so that you can continue to go back to train and sprint. I look at it that way too, that I have to do all this other strength and you know, resistance training type stuff just to stay healthy enough to stay running and doing the higher volume stuff. Maybe that's a part of it too, but I definitely think that backwards running fits somewhere in that paradigm of, if I'm going to do this other type of non-specific training, it seems like a little bit more specific training because of the speed, but helps me continue to sprint. So yeah, I definitely think there's utility, especially if you have pain. You know, if you got knee pain, you can't run forward that fast, but if you can run backwards as fast as possible and get a great training stimulus out of it from the ankle perspective and a little bit from the quad and increase stiffness at the knee, that's a net positive in my book. You know, I'd rather do that than not be able to run forward.
Q, going off of what's up, dude? So it sounds like to me, and we saw this done a little bit when we were at UNC, but this kind of fits in your program is like almost a tempo day, where it's like one of your low days. But I wanted to ask the question of, have you ever like put it on a high day when you're like, I'm supposed to forward sprint today, but I'm not feeling super great. Because this is like one of the next best things I can do. Let me put it in.
Mm-hmm. So there's one paper, and I don't know if I sent it to you, Chris. It might have been one of those 4. It was they were really investigating like the post-activation potential of reverse running before max effort sprinting forward. It was a kind of a smaller sample size. Again, it was like only 15 to 17 kids in each group. It was with younger kids as well. I think the same age, about 14 to 15-year-old males. And they found a significant increase for the 0 to 10 meter speeds, but not for 10 to 20 in that particular one. I'll say, with that being said, for me, on my, like today, I have a little bit longer distance, building up to max effort top end velocity today. I'll almost always do like 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100% over the course of 30 to 50 yards in reverse as a warm up before I start my forward running training, because it feels really good. It's very non-threatening. You know, I think if you're dealing with some aches and pains and you just get out on the field and you start doing the skip drills and the other like running drills, it sometimes is like, oh gosh, like here we go. You know, it kind of feels like you're dragging, but I can go in reverse and it's like kind of pain free. And then by the time I'm done, I am like max effort sprinting in reverse as hard and fast as I can. And it doesn't really bother me. And then I can flip it around and start at like 50 or 60% going forward. And I don't even have to do very many sprints going forward. Again, guys, you know, this is so anecdotal. So I got to keep myself in check here. This is anecdotal, what works for me. This is not, I'm not suggesting this is how you do this shindig, but I'm telling you, this is how it works for me. And it works well. It seems like I'm able to run better, and I don't need as much of a warm up if I just do backwards running as an intro. So in answer to your question, Mace, yeah, I do it twice a week at least, in conjunction with max effort forward sprinting, whether it's acceleration or whether it's a top end speed over the course of like 80 to 100 meters.
Word. Thanks, dude.
Yeah, love you, Mace. This guy. Anyone doesn't know, Mason and I were strength and conditioning interns together at the University of North Carolina, so we go back a ways.
Yeah.
Is there, because there's literally zero, well not zero, but very little eccentric component, is there not really any major DOMs, even if this is like brand new for someone? Or because it's still such a high quad stimulus, they get pretty sore?
No, man. From my own, and then from the patients that I've done it with, they're really not super sore afterwards, because yeah, it's primarily isometric or concentric effort. It'd be like carry or like sled push. It's pretty much all concentric. There's really not like a whole lot of absorption eccentric phase in that, so you really don't get sore. You just feel like you're gonna puke. you know, and it just crazy muscle burn during it. But then once it's off, like you're good. So throughout the day, they might feel a little bit more like just kind of fatiguey, like just tired muscle wise. But when you wake up in the morning, um, at least from what they've been telling me, it's like, hey, ready for another day. We can repeat it. So I can repeat backwards running type stuff 2 to 3 times a week with them, especially when they're having knee pain and forward running is limited. They can repeat backwards running pretty often with really good tolerance. I don't do it quite that much. I don't know why. I don't know, time. But I don't feel like I get excessively sore from backwards running. If you're going to be sore anywhere, it'd probably be in your hip flexors. The hip flexor moment in running backwards is quite a bit greater than running forwards, because when you contact and then as you're pushing your pelvis over the top of that stance leg, you're going to be using a little bit more hip flexor in a closed chain capacity versus the open chain hip flexor moment in running forward. So if you're going to be sore anywhere or be thinking about anything, so if you have like a hip arthroscopy type patients who are already maybe a little bit at risk for developing some of that psoas, you know, hip flexor tendinopathy type stuff, or like at least sensitivity, that might be a consideration that you'd want a little bit more upright trunk and stick to a little bit slower speeds if that was an issue. But yeah, overall, I mean, I don't think we train hip flexors enough either. We do a lot of pushing. We do a lot of squats and deadlifts and worrying about pushing the ground away from us. We don't do a whole lot of, repositioning that leg to produce that same force. And if you get a heavier leg with strength training and, you put 20 pounds of meat on your thigh, well, you still got to cycle that 20 pounds of meat for another stride. So I think, hip flexor training, you're getting some of that out of this mix as well, with that reverse type sprinting. So anyways.
What is the hamstring look like activation versus forwards running? Because I was thinking for like a hamstring strain, would this be a good protocol initially if they're super sensitized to like a forward run?
Say it again.
Would a hamstring, like someone who has a hamstring strain, would backwards running decrease the level of hamstring activation?
I don't know, but I can tell you, so this past year in 2020 over the summer, I was dealing with some pretty chronic hamstring stuff. I pulled it pretty bad one time, and then it would go 4 to 6 weeks, and I'd start reintegrating to sprint, and then it would be like, ooh, there it is again. It'd pull again. That happened maybe 2 or 3 times over the summer. And almost every time it happened, I could do a lot more of that reverse running than I could forward running. And I could run way faster going backwards, and it didn't bother me. So that might have been, I don't know if it's going to change based on which hamstring we're talking about, or if you have a high hamstring pull versus a low, like near the knee, that I would imagine might change things just because of the hip extension component versus knee flexion component. Because when you're cycling backwards, you have to have a fair amount of knee flexion strength to be able to cycle well enough. But your momentum of powerful push off and knee flexion will kind of carry that momentum into your hip extension when you're running backwards. So you don't, you're going to be reaching, but when you're running forward, you really kind of having to pull yourself over that leg a little bit more. So I don't know. I haven't seen a whole lot of studies on like the actual hamstring stress in that regard, but I know anecdotally I was able to tolerate a lot more backwards running initially and still keep a high like metabolic conditioning level. Yeah. Also, Geronimo, thanks, man. Yes, not muscle damage. It's all neurological. So, but I think in general, that more eccentric, especially very very quick eccentric type movements, just have a tendency to increase that neurological sensitivity, especially if it's a new stimulus. So, that would be the other consideration, Geronimo, that if it's totally new, like reverse running is a brand new thing, or just running in general, you're going to have to take a little bit slower approach into integrating backwards running. Like you couldn't just take somebody who hasn't run much at all and then reverse run them hard, max effort, and expect them not to be sore at all. Like that's not what I was trying to say. I just think if somebody is already like a recreational athlete, or you're dealing with younger athletes, and then tell them to run backwards because running forwards is aggravating or for whatever reason, or if you're just looking at it from a sports performance perspective, they're already doing a high volume of other type training, and now you're just running backwards. That's more of what I'm saying. Probably won't induce a whole lot of soreness and maybe a little bit more trained person. But yeah, if you take someone totally not used to any training at all and do anything, they're probably going to be somewhat fatigued and sore. So, anyways, good comment.
I'm with it. I think I'm okay with saying that it's probably a new stimulus, and if people enjoy like running and can't do it right now, that is enough for me to try it. Like I mean, I'm sure there's a million different things going on, and maybe it is all contextual, and like I don't know, who cares? But like I'm totally with it, especially for knee pain. Question for you, so you can save me like 2 hours of reading. If I was looking into sprinting, and I wanted to know what's the minimal change for sprinting performance that would matter to somebody, what off the top of your head do you know what you kind of look for in papers?
Give me 2 hours.
Great.
No,
Like pain, usually like 1.5 is like, we can argue about whether that's important or not, but at least around there.
Yeah, for sure. No, that's a good question. I think it really depends on the population, man. Because if you're training a pretty high level athlete, if you're making like this much of a change, that's all that matters. If you're dealing with 14, 15-year-old kids, you can get a 14, 15-year-old kid a whole lot faster with just nonsense training. We see it all the time, right? You got high school dads walk into the weight room that read, something off bodybuilding.com 15 years ago, or T Nation, and walk in and say, all right, boys, we're doing this today. And the kids get better. And, the dad's like, I'm the man. Like, I made these kids, we grind, we work here, but it doesn't, so I don't know. I think it really just depends on what kind of athlete you're working on. And in the literature, there are, gosh, I've got a list of forward sprint papers, about 8 of them here, that I could look through and try to, see if I could get a number on that, or I could send them to you and you could try to figure that out. But dude, I don't know. I think it just really is kind of depending on what kind of person you're looking at.
I mean,
does that make sense, man? I know that's not.
I mean, I figured as much. I mean, that's how it is in pain, right? Like in studies, we always see like everybody's got a baseline 4 out of 10 pain. So like that 1.5 difference clinically, when you go down to from 4 to 2.5, it's probably pretty good. But if you have somebody coming in with like true 6 or 7 out of 10, 1.5 difference, ain't so good when you're ending up at 5.5, right? And that's the whole problem with. So I imagine it'd be the exact, like how you're saying, like if you're talking about an amateur, like it might be a completely different, you need a lot more of a change or something to happen or an effect for it to matter to that person. But if it's an elite athlete, it's a very small effect could actually matter. So it makes total sense to me.
Yeah,
I'll go read for 3 hours.
Yes, okay. You see the same thing with like all of the strength and conditioning research, right? If you have like untrained versus trained people, like, and then they're measuring, muscle strength or 1 RMs or max volitional contraction, and in the elite guys, you're seeing like very small changes, and you might look at that from the surface and be like, oh, well, that training stimulus is probably not that effective then, because I'm seeing this really small effect size. But then when you consider like, oh, the population, or you can see other stuff, right? The flip, where you're taking untrained people, putting them through a training program, and they have these massive responses. It's kind of like, well, they were untrained. So yeah, you see this a lot in literature. So I hope to, maybe I have a better answer for you in a couple years from now. But any other questions? Anybody else thinking stuff? I'm trying to look through the chat now and see what I missed. I see these little things popping up in the corner, but
I have a question. with, I guess this is just your experience, but the people that you had on the treadmill, like with the pad behind them and doing, it's almost just like a resisted, I don't know, knee extension at that point because they have like their back against the wall. Would your, or the treadmill, would your progression for, like, say they had knee pain, like would you then want to see them backwards run without, like, something behind them, because like the freedom of that, like if they had knee pain, or would you still be trying to dip into like forwards running?
So just to get your question right, so the treadmill walking group, the people that I've done that with, having kind of more of that backwards lean, and it's more just like purely repeated knee extension, kind of in that closed chain, right?
Yeah.
And then your question is like, okay, so what's that next step look like? Do we go right from kind of that treadmill type thing into a reverse run, or do we go from like the treadmill type thing into forward running? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, obviously patient dependent, but like I'm just curious your experience on like what you would do from that point. Yeah.
Okay. It it depends. So the patients, two of the patients that I've done it with are TKA patients, so I'm probably not going to have them go right into forward or reverse running right off the bat. So walk before you run, I guess, right? So I'll do like a little bit of reverse walking with them, just like upright, so get off the treadmill, do a couple of down back laps of like 10 meters forward, 10 meters backwards, 10 meters forward, 10 meter backwards, just to start integrating more step volume and more reverse walking into there, kind of sneaking it in. And they just think that they're just recovering from the hell I put them through on the treadmill, but I think there's some value there. There's two younger athletes that I've thrown. Like one of them is, gosh, how old is he? 13. And then a little bit older one who's like 24, 25 that I've done on the reverse treadmill. For them, they were already running a little bit and experimenting with more plyometric type stuff. So for them, it was like it didn't matter. I could take them out on the field and do reverse running right away, and it wasn't a big deal. And I use the treadmill for them. It's way more of just a conditioning stimulus, versus for the TKA patients, it's conditioning, but it's also trying to get that quad to fire. It's getting some closed chain pressure through the foot. It's getting them confident in their abilities, getting that terminal knee extension, because the tread will actually like pull their knee into extension as they're finishing off that pull. It'll kind of like take them another like couple degrees that they weren't wanting over and over and over and over and over and over again on the treadmill. So I kind of like that too. So just, I guess, depends on how you want to cook it up, but maybe those are some things that I'm initially thinking in my head to answer your question. Does that help? Is that helpful?
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you.
Does that change? Do you change angle of the treadmill ever, or is that just an awful idea?
Yeah. So do you mean like the incline? Yeah. Yeah, for sure. You can play around. So if they can't get the tread started on their own, it depends on the treadmill you have, because some of them, when you turn the treadmill off, the tread will automatically go back to flat. And so then your other option is like, well, do I have to pick the whole damn treadmill up and like put like pads or blocks underneath the front of it to like tilt it up? Like that's just way more effort than it's worth. But some treadmills, yeah, you can just put the tread up. Or what I'll have them do is I'll put like the tread, I'll turn it on so it'll actually be moving. And then I'll put the gradient up a couple degrees, and then the speed I'll take down a little bit, and then just they'll try to keep up with it, sort of walking uphill. The other way you do that is just have them, depending on how tall they are, if they're really tall, their angle is already going to be a lot more to get their hips on the front side of the treadmill. That angle is going to be a little steeper, or depending on how much knee flexion they have or knee extension strength they have. If they're tall and they go more upright, they're having to really reach that leg underneath them and reach back and pull. So there's a couple of variables that you're playing with. I just look for how smooth is it, how is it getting, or is it looking like kind of that stimulus that I'm wanting to get out of that day based on where they're at, and is it hard enough that they are ready to die after a minute or two of doing it straight through. You know what I mean? So there's a couple of variables you're trying to move to make it, specific or adjustable for that person that you're going to have to play with. But yeah, I don't know. It just kind of depends on the anthropomorphics of the human in front of you. Because if you got like a really short little kid, he's going to have a little bit harder time getting in there. And so you have to kind of adjust some things. And then if you have a really tall or a really, really large person, that's going to change some of what you have to do to make it work for you. But again, if you had a sled and a ton of space, you could just, tie the sled around their hips and have them lean back and go. The only problem with that is that if they're afraid of falling back, you're putting them in a little bit of a compromised position because there's nothing to catch them. Whereas on the treadmill, like you have two arm rails on either side of them that they're like gripping onto for dear life if they're afraid of it. And their back is up against like a hard plastic machine that they don't feel like is going anywhere. And they can just worry solely on kicking versus when you do the when you do the sled, they're balancing, a couple of steps will be off, they're kind of shuffling, they're worried about falling backwards. So it just depends, who you're dealing with, I think, but there's a couple of ways to get the job done.
All right. Does anyone have anything else? If not, we can wrap it up.
Yeah, I've got 2 questions. Q, how often, like how many days a week do you watch Cool Runnings for motivation? And then second, could you maybe share the papers you've had for for the backwards running on the lower leg? I'm having trouble finding some of those.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You want me to just put them in the chat?
You can.
Yeah, that'd be super.
I can also, if you send them to me, I can send them to everyone as well.
Okay.
That makes your life easier, Q.
Yeah, cool. Let's we'll do that. What is this? Geronimo, biomechanics and metabolism, hard desk reject.
That's the name of the paper that he put up. And I was like, yeah, I'm not reading this. It was like the title of the paper that Kevin just put up.
I just put it in there because it had like the different gradients we were talking about, uphill versus,
Yeah.
That's way too
for
hard for
sure.
me. My brain will melt.
No, it's fine. The walk away, I guess, or the takeaway from, like, if you're thinking about just the biomechanics of backwards running and metabolism or energy demand, is that at given absolute paces, backwards running is going to be far more metabolically demanding than forward running, if that saves you some time. So according to Conti et al., it was 28% for metabolic cost. That was measured with calorimetry. So quite a bit.
Wow. All right. This is great, man. This is a very different, more niche conversation than normal, which was kind of the goal. So, party. All right. Yo, thanks, man.
Cool, guys. I hope it's useful. I know it's a weird, stringent, fringe kind of a thing, but I think there's utility, man. It's good for people with pain and make the grinders get a grind. And I don't know. I like it. I just like it.
Yeah, I'm going to try it out.
All right. Give it a shot. If you guys are doing some backwards running this week, go ahead and tag me on the IG. Like, yo, getting it in, running backwards. You guys are all going to look so foolish. It's going to be awesome. I'll post my own too. I'm going to do it today. So maybe I'll tag at least Chris, and then you can tag all you or something. I don't know.
Sweet. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining the party, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
All right.
All right.
See you guys.
Adios.